Please subscribe, like, and share. It really helps us out. And of course, if you have any questions, comment below and we will answer you as soon as we can. Welcome to another video in our series on IGCSE History. In today's lesson, we will be looking at the Cold War origins 1941 to 1948. If you haven't seen our previous videos, click on the card above.
Today we're going to be looking at the Cold War origins between 1941 and 1948. The USA entered World War II against Germany and Japan in 1941, creating an uneasy alliance of the USA, Britain, and the USSR. This alliance would ultimately fail and break down into the Cold War. The alliance of the USA and the USSR during World War II brought together two sides that were divided by their political ideologies. The USA and Britain were capitalist countries, while since its foundation after the 1917 Russian Revolution, the USSR had been communist. However, the actions of Nazi Germany and its ally Japan in World War II had driven these two political enemies together. Firstly, Britain had been at war with Germany since Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. Secondly, the USSR allied itself with Britain in 1941 when Germany began to invade its territories. Thirdly, in December 1941, Germany's ally Japan launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, Hawaii. These actions brought the USA into World War II on the same side as Britain and the USSR. At this point, I think it's important to understand the differences between capitalism and communism. Firstly, capitalism. There are several political parties representing different sectors of society. Governments are chosen by democratic elections. People are free to set up private businesses and make money for themselves. Individual rights and freedoms are important. Now, communism. Communism is a one-party state. No democratic elections and no opportunity to change the government by election. All businesses and factories are owned by the state. Individual rights and freedoms are less important than obedience to the state. In February of 1945, the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin, met at Yalta in the Crimean region of the USSR. With an Allied victory looking likely, the aim of the Yalta Conference was to decide what to do with Germany once it had been defeated. In many ways, the Yalta Conference set the scene for the rest of the Cold War in Europe. So, what were the outcomes? Firstly, Germany would be divided into 4 zones of occupation, with the USSR, Britain, France and the USA each controlling a zone. France had been liberated from Nazi Germany and was included in the conference partly due to pressure from the French leader General de Gaulle, but also because Britain wanted a European ally with whom it could share the cost of post-war reconstruction of Germany. Secondly, the German capital of Berlin was deep inside the Soviet zone, and it too was divided into 4 zones, each controlled by one of the Allied powers. Berlin would be a source of tension throughout the Cold War. Thirdly, all countries freed from Nazi control were to be guaranteed the right to hold free elections and choose their own government. However, Stalin was offered a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. Next, Stalin once again promised to join the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. All leaders made a commitment to hunt down Nazi war criminals. the Allies agreed to setting up the United Nations, an organisation with the objectives of ensuring international cooperation and preventing future wars. The three countries met again in 1945 at the Potsdam Conference. The main objective of the Potsdam Conference was to finalise a post-war settlement and put into action all the things agreed at Yalta. While the meeting at Yalta had been reasonably friendly, the Potsdam Conference was fraught with disagreements, which were the result of some significant changes that had taken place since the Yalta Conference. Firstly, a new US President. The US President Franklin D. Roosevelt had died and been replaced by his Vice President Harry S. Truman. While Roosevelt had been willing to work with Stalin, largely because he needed the USSR to join the war against Japan, Truman made little secret of his dislike for communism and for Stalin personally. Truman remarked that he was tired of babysitting the Soviets, and that the only language Stalin understood was how many army divisions you have. Secondly, the nuclear threat. Just before the conference began, on 16th July 1945, the USA had successfully exploded an atomic bomb at their test site in the New Mexico desert. When first told about the success of the experiment, Truman is said to have remarked, "If it works, I'll sure have a hammer on those boys." At Potsdam, Truman chose to inform Stalin that the US possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Thirdly, the expansion of communism. Despite agreeing at Yalta that free elections were to be held in Eastern Europe after the defeat of Nazi Germany, there was little evidence at Potsdam that Stalin intended to allow them. In fact, the Red Army was in control of Poland, and the USSR was in the process of setting up a communist government. So what were the outcomes? Little real progress was made at Potsdam beyond an agreement to put into action the commitments made at Yalta. So let's try and summarize the two conferences. You can use the acronym PEER, People, Elections, Europe and Reparations to remember the main points. At Yalta, the participants were Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin. Germany to be divided into 4 zones of occupation. Berlin also to be divided. The USSR would be allowed to take reparations from a defeated Germany. Stalin to have a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, but all countries freed from Nazi occupation would be allowed free elections to choose their own government. Now let's look at Potsdam. The participants were Churchill, replaced midway by Attlee, Truman and Stalin. There were arguments over where the boundaries between the zones would be drawn. There were arguments about how much the USSR should be allowed to take in reparations. It was agreed that the Soviets could take whatever they wanted from Soviet-controlled zones and 10% from the Western zones. This remained a source of disagreement with the Western Allies, worried that they were repeating the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. There was no sign of Stalin allowing free elections to Eastern Europe, and a communist government was being set up in Poland. That brings us to Japan and the atomic bomb in 1945. On the 6th of August 1945, the USA dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The blast devastated an area of 5 square miles, destroying more than 60% of the city's buildings and killing around 140,000 people. 3 days later, the US dropped the second atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, killing 74,000 people. So why were the bombs dropped? The official US justification for the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs were to force the Japanese government to surrender, which it did on the 14th of August 1945. Some historians have speculated that the bombs might also have had another purpose, to send a warning to the Soviet Union about the strength of the American military. Whatever the intention, the USA had changed the nature of warfare, and for the remainder of the Cold War, the threat of atomic weapons and nuclear war would be a constant theme. Stalin himself remarked that future wars were inevitable, and the Soviet Union now stepped up its own program of atomic research. American nuclear hegemony would not last long. That brings us to the Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe. Despite the promises made by Stalin at the Yalta Conference to allow free elections, he had in fact started turning Eastern Europe into a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. Stalin feared that Eastern Europe could be the doorway for an attack on the Soviet Union by the West. So we'll go through a brief timeline of the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe. Firstly, Albania, 1945. A communist government took power at the end of World War II. Secondly, Bulgaria, 1946. In 1946, the Bulgarian monarch was abolished, and later that year, a communist government was elected and gradually eradicated its opponents. East Germany, 1945. East Germany was part of the Soviet zone of occupation agreed to in the Yalta Conference in 1945. The Soviets set up a communist regime. Romania, 1945. In the 1945 elections, a communist-led coalition government was elected. The communists gradually removed their coalition partners and abolished the Romanian monarchy. Poland, 1947. Fearing that non-communist governments would be elected in 1947, Stalin invited 16 non-communist politicians to Moscow, where they were arrested. With their political opponents removed, the Polish communists won the election. Hungary, 1948. Although non-communists won the 1945 election, a communist politician, Rakowski, took control of the secret police and used it to arrest and execute his political opponents. By 1948, the Communist Party was in complete control of the country. Czechoslovakia, 1948. Czechoslovakia was the last country in Eastern Europe to fully fall to communism in 1948. At elections that year, only communists were allowed to stand, and a communist government was duly elected. For the Western Allies, the setting up of communist government in Eastern Europe was a major concern. World War II had been fought in the name of freedom. Now it seemed that in many countries the hard-won freedom from Nazi dictatorship was being replaced by communist dictatorship. So what were the reactions to Soviet expansion? Firstly, an exchange of telegrams. 1. The long telegram. In 1946, George Kennan, an official at the US Embassy in Moscow, was asked to provide a summary of what the Soviets were up to. His response became known as the long telegram, because at 8,000 words it was indeed long. In much fewer than 8,000 words, what Kennan's telegram said was that the USSR was heavily armed and feared the outside world. It was determined to spread communism, and therefore it could be no peaceful coexistence between the USSR and the USA. However, the USA was stronger than the USSR, so communism could be contained. 2. The Novikov telegram. The Soviet response to the long telegram was the Novikov telegram, in which the Soviet ambassador to the USA, Nikolai Novikov, warned that the USA had emerged from World War II economically strong and bent on world domination. As a result, the USSR needed to secure its buffer zone in Eastern Europe. The two telegrams set the scene for the Cold War in Europe. The USSR would attempt to dominate Eastern Europe and spread communism where possible. The USA would commit to a policy of containment. Secondly, the Iron Curtain speech. On the 5th of March 1946, the by now former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill condemned the Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe in his famous Iron Curtain speech. In that speech he famously noted that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. In a nutshell, what Churchill meant by this was that the Allies had spent 6 years fighting for freedom from fascism in Europe, only to have half the continent now under Soviet dictatorship. Thirdly, the Truman Doctrine. Not wanting to be left out of the rush to make speeches, President Truman made a speech to the US Congress in which he promised that the USA would provide aid to any country standing up against communism. This was developed into the Truman Doctrine. Note how vague the word aid is. It meant that America could provide anything from a pat on the back up to military intervention. America was now committed to a policy of containment or stopping the spread of communism. The doctrine itself was initially aimed at providing financial aid to Greece and Turkey. They had both been occupied by Nazi Germany during World War II, so needed financial assistance to avoid falling to communism. Part of the reason for Truman's powerful language was that he needed to persuade Congress of the need for $400 million to help these two countries. Fourthly, the Marshall Plan. Fearing that all of Europe would fall under communist control, in 1947 President Truman sent General George Marshall to see what could be done to ensure this didn't happen. Marshall recommended spending a lot of money, more than $12 billion to be exact. The Marshall aid would be spent to help the economies of Western Europe recover after World War II and make it less likely to fall prey to communism. Marshall aid was effectively a propaganda tool, a way of saying, hey, look at how wealthy we are, you don't need that communist nonsense, stick with us and you'll be wealthy too. The aid was offered to all countries, but Truman knew that the conditions were such that they would probably not take it up. Stalin blocked Czechoslovakia when they considered accepting the financial assistance on offer. So what was the Soviet response? The USSR objected to the Marshall Plan in the following ways. It declared Marshall aid to be dollar imperialism and claimed the USA was throwing its economic weight around, using it to gain influence in Europe. It forbade the Eastern Bloc countries under its control to apply for Marshall aid. It set up Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau, an organization which had at its aim to tighten Soviet control in Eastern Europe, to build collective heavy industry in those countries, and to create trade network between communist countries. It also established Comecon, the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, to administer its own Molotov plan of financial aid to keep the Eastern Bloc countries on side. Lastly for today, the Berlin blockade and Berlin Airlift, 1948 to 1949. Ever since the Yalta Conference, it has been clear that Berlin was going to be a flashpoint in the Cold War, and this came to a head in 1948. Firstly, Germany had been divided into 4 zones of occupation, each controlled by one of the Allies. Secondly, the German capital, Berlin, lay inside the Russian zone, and was also divided into 4 zones of occupation. Thirdly, access to Berlin for the Allies was by way of road, rail and canal, and via 3 specific air corridors. So what was the cause of the Berlin blockade? Stalin wanted Germany to remain weak, as a strong Germany could represent a threat to the Soviet Union. The Western Allies disagreed and were encouraging Germany to rebuild in the western sectors. This angered Stalin, who decided to force the Allies out of Berlin. It is also important to note that at this stage the USSR had not yet developed its own atomic weapons. So what were the Western Allies doing in Berlin that made Stalin so upset? Firstly, under the Marshall Plan, the US supplied goods to German shops for workers to buy. This was a nice way of showing the communists that America's capitalist economy was flourishing. Secondly, at a meeting in London in January 1948, Britain and the USA joined their zones together to create Bizonia and make it easier to administer them. France would later join, and they'd change the name to West Germany. Thirdly, using money from the Marshall Aid Program, their allies were helping the Germans to rebuild their economy. This meant a new stable currency and more jobs for workers in the western sectors. The day after the new currency was introduced, the blockade was put in place. On the 24th of June 1948, Stalin cut all land access to Berlin for the Allies. This became known as the Berlin blockade. Stalin hoped the effect of the blockade would be to make West Berliners leave and join the East, or that America might even withdraw from Berlin altogether, completing the communist takeover of the Eastern Bloc. So what did the Berlin blockade mean for West Berlin? Firstly, Berlin could now only be accessed by air, resulting in a restriction on the freedoms to travel outside Berlin for all Germans. Secondly, a shortage of food. West Berlin only had enough food for 36 days. Thirdly, a lack of basic goods like fuel and medicines. What was the reaction of the Western Allies? The Berlin blockade was the first real test for the American policy of containment, as forcing their way into the city by land would have led to another war. The Allies decided that their sectors of Berlin would be supplied by air. This became known as the Berlin Airlift, and it lasted for 11 months until the blockade was lifted in May 1949. At the height of the Berlin Airlift, a plane landed at Berlin's Tempelhof Airport every minute. Keeping West Berlin supplied in this way cost the USA $350 million and Britain £17 million. Stalin was powerless to stop the Berlin Airlift. To shoot down the plane would have provoked World War III, and at this stage, unlike the USA, the USSR did not have nuclear weapons. As the air corridors had been agreed at Yalta, the USA were doing nothing wrong as long as they stuck to the boundaries of the 3 air corridors. In the aftermath of the Berlin blockade, Berlin remained a source of tension in Europe for the duration of the Cold War. In April 1949, the USA, Britain and France officially announced the formation of the German Federal Republic, or West Germany. Elections in the German Federal Republic in August 1949 resulted in a victory for the anti-communist politician Konrad Adenauer and the Christian Democratic Union. Stalin responded to the formation of NATO with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, after West Germany were admitted to NATO. The Warsaw Pact was an alliance of the communist countries of Eastern Europe for their mutual defence. Finally, on the 29th of August 1949, the USSR exploded its first atomic bomb. The USA no longer had a monopoly on nuclear weapons.
Thank you for watching our video. Please like, subscribe and share. And comment below so we can clarify things for you.